Bear down, fam. $76.4 million. That's Josh Sweat's deal, and according to ESPN's Dan Graziano, Sweat is uncomfortable, real uncomfortable out in Arizona. Bleacher Report already put the Bears' name out there as a landing spot. In a minute, I'll break down why this rumor hits different than the last ones, and why he could be the cheapest piece for Ryan Poole's plan around Caleb Williams. While the defensive front's moving quiet, Kevin Warren broke his own silence. The Bears president spoke up after over a month of nothing, and he dropped a line about Hammond, Indiana that gives away more than he meant to. I'm getting into that right now, and this ties straight into what's next, because the WR1 spot is also at war. Rome Odunze versus Luther Burden III. There's a detail about Odunze's foot that the organization is trying to keep quiet, and I'm not so sure they should. Let's get into it, Windy City, because this one's gonna have you thinking all weeks. Okay, hold on a second, because this story comes with more layers than it seems at first glance, and I want to break it down completely before giving you my opinion. Let's start with who Josh Sweat is, because some people still only remember him as the edge rusher who won the Super Bowl with Philadelphia. In March of 2025, Sweat signed a 4-year, $76.4 million deal with the Arizona Cardinals, with $41 million guaranteed. It was one of the most talked about signings of that free agency class, because Sweat was coming off a ring with the Eagles and reuniting with Jonathan Gannon, his former defensive coordinator in Philadelphia, who was already the Cardinals' head coach. And here's the first thing you need to understand clearly. Sweat delivered, and then some. He played all 17 games in the 2025 season, his second straight full season, and finished with career highs, 12 sacks and 4 forced fumbles, plus 28 pressures. In a season where Arizona was one of the worst teams in the league, Sweat was pretty much the only consistent bright spot on that defense. But here's where the story gets interesting, because despite Sweat's individual production, the Cardinals finished tied for third fewest sacks in the entire NFL, only 30 total, and their overall defense allowed 28.7 points per game, ranked 29th out of 32 teams. That means Sweat was carrying an entire defense practically by himself, and that kind of situation in the NFL almost always ends up generating frustration on the player's side, and the frustration arrived. In January, Arizona fired Jonathan Gannon after a 4-win, 13-loss season, and here is the detail that I think is central to this whole situation. Sweat had signed with the Cardinals specifically to play under Gannon again. When they fired Gannon and hired Mike LaFleur as the new head coach, even though they kept defensive coordinator Nick Rallis, the main reason Sweat chose Arizona disappeared overnight. Since then, according to ESPN's Dan Graziano, Sweat has stayed away from the team's voluntary offseason program and has let it be known, not through his own public words, but pretty clearly through his behavior, that he is not happy in Arizona. And this detail matters, because Sweat also stayed away from voluntary activities last year, when Gannon was still in charge, so some argue this could simply be how he normally handles the offseason and not necessarily a sign of discontent. But the difference this time is the context. The coach he came for is no longer there, and that completely changes how his absence gets read. Let's go to the contract numbers, because this is fundamental to understanding how realistic a trade actually is. Sweat has $0 guaranteed on his contract starting in the 2027 season. If the Cardinals traded him this year, they would absorb roughly $22 million in dead money, $5.5 million this year and $16.5 million next year. The team acquiring him would take on a guaranteed commitment of $17 million for 2027, and nothing guaranteed after that. Look at that number carefully, because compared to most edge rusher contracts at this level in today's market, this is relatively cheap and low risk long term for whoever acquires him. Ian Rappaport himself came out weeks ago to put out the fire, saying the Cardinals are not trading Sweat, not to the Packers, who had been linked because Gannon ended up as their defensive coordinator, and not anywhere else. And Arizona's general manager, Monty Ossenfort, whose own job could be on the line after the season they had, does not seem to be in any hurry to part with his best defensive player while there is still a chance to fight for the playoffs. But here's what changed this week, and why this rumor carries different weight than the previous ones. Mo Moton of Bleacher Report published his list of moves every NFL team should consider before the start of the season, and for the Cardinals, the suggestion was exactly this: trade an uncomfortable Sweat for a 2027 second-round draft pick. He put it in black and white. If Arizona cannot find a team willing to give up a player in return, they should stockpile draft capital for 27, because that class is expected to be especially strong, and that is where the Bears' name came up as a potential destination, with the logic that a pass rush hungry team like Chicago could land Sweat for the price of a day 2 second-round pick, much cheaper than anything discussed with Max Crosby over the last several months. And I want to be honest with you about something I have been analyzing on this channel for months. The Bears had already been linked to Crosby of the Raiders since March, and that conversation always ended up the same place: an extremely expensive player with a cap hit north of $35 million. and a recent medical history from knee surgery that scared even the Ravens enough to cancel an already agreed trade. Sweat is, in almost every relevant sense, the cheaper, lower-risk version of the same need. He will turn 30 next year, so he is not a young player, but he is coming off 16-17 games played and his best sack production of his career, and the acquisition cost, a day 2 pick, is a fraction of what it would take to convince the Raiders to let go of Crosby. Now, the honest comparison between the two, because I do not want to sell you this like it is an obvious decision. Crosby is, without question, the higher ceiling player between the two, a 5-time Pro Bowler, a motor that never stops, but he also carries a 3-year, $106.5 million contract with $91.5 million guaranteed, a recent knee surgery, and an organization in the Raiders that still has not shown any concrete signs it will sell before the November deadline. Sweat, on the other hand, is already in an environment where the player himself is showing active discontent, with a much more manageable contract starting next year and with a general manager whose job depends on immediate results, which in NFL history almost always ends up speeding up sales of uncomfortable assets. My personal read, and I could be completely wrong because there is not a single confirmed call yet between Chicago and Arizona, if Ryan Poles wants to fix the pass rush with the least financial and draft capital risk possible, Sweat is the smarter move of the two, not the flashiest, but the smarter one. The problem is that right now this remains, at best, an editorial suggestion from a Bleacher Report analyst and not a confirmed negotiation. Rappaport already said it clearly, the Cardinals are not moving Sweat right now. But if Arizona starts the season losing, and everything points to that defense still being a structural problem, the November conversation could look completely different than the July one, and if that happens, I want you to remember this video because the Bears will be in that conversation, official announcement or not. And while the defensive front moves quietly, another front of the organization finally broke its own silence this week. Okay fam, I need us to understand the sequence of this week correctly. If you only saw the headline, you missed the important part. On Thursday, at an event in Lake Forest called Talking Football with Kevin Warren, the Bears president spoke publicly for the first time since June 4th, and June 4th is not just any date. That was the day Warren and the organization's board of directors voted to formally advance a stadium project in Hammond, Indiana. 1 month and 13 days of total silence, while all of Chicago wondered what was going on, and the guy chooses an event with pre-submitted screened questions to reappear. That already tells you something about how the organization is handling the communication around all of this. Let's go through the full context, because some people still think this is a simple back and forth. It is not. The Bears bought 326 acres at Arlington Park in 2023 for $197.2 million. That was the first step toward what was supposed to be their own domed stadium in the Chicago suburbs, funded mostly with the franchise's own private money. But for 3 years this stalled out in Springfield in the Illinois legislature because the Bears need something called property tax certainty, and that mechanism never got formally approved. And here's what Warren said Thursday, word for word, and I want us to listen to this carefully because this is the key to the entire problem. He said they have always been clear that they need property tax certainty, that the numbers are too big without it, that they need an infrastructure commitment, and that they need a good partner because no matter where they build, there are always going to be complications. Look, that quote sounds reasonable in a vacuum, but when you put it next to what happened just weeks earlier, things change. The Illinois legislature adjourned its session on June 1st without passing any stadium legislation. 3 days later, the Bears board votes to advance Indiana. That is not a slow deliberative process. That is an organization that had already made the decision and waited for the right political moment to announce it. And here's what I think is the most revealing part of the entire press conference. Warren never, not once, mentioned Arlington Heights by name. Not to rule it out, not to keep it alive. He erased it from the public conversation entirely. That could be negotiating strategy, leaving the door cracked open without committing publicly, or it could be exactly what it looks like, that Illinois has already stopped being Plan A. Now let's talk about the real numbers coming out of Indiana, because this is where things get interesting and honestly a little more complicated than people assume. In February, Indiana lawmakers approved putting up to $1 billion in public funds toward building a dome stadium in Hammond. The Bears, for their part, committed to putting up $2 billion of their own money. In exchange for that $2 billion, the Bears would be tenants of the site, not owners, but they would keep absolutely all of the operating revenue, events, concerts, off-season bookings, everything. That changes the financial calculation quite a bit from what people assume when they hear the word tenant. But there are serious questions that neither Indiana nor the Bears have resolved yet, and I want to be honest with you about this. Financial analysts are openly questioning whether the planned taxes in Indiana will be enough to cover the construction debt. The Chicago Tribune reporter who covered this quoted a specialist named Profiter saying the final cost of buying the land, building, maintaining the stadium, and what else that money could have been used for are all still unknowns. With $1 billion in public funds committed up front, that uncertainty carries weight, and there is another issue being discussed behind closed doors in Indiana that almost nobody is covering with the seriousness it deserves. The original site in Hammond had environmental remediation problems, so now they are moving the project closer to the state line, about 19 miles from downtown Chicago, trying trying to dodge those contaminated soil issues. Soil samples are being taken and analyzed, but this is nowhere close to finalized, and this is a detail that does confirm to me Indiana is serious. Construction unions in Northwest Indiana, more than 30 different trade unions representing thousands of workers, came out publicly this week saying they will not support any politician who does not back the food and beverage tax that funds part of this deal. We are talking about an extra $1 tax on every $100 restaurant bill. When unions start threatening political careers over a stadium, that tells you there is already too much money and too many jobs at stake for this to fall apart easily. Let me give you my personal read on all of this, and I could be wrong, but I have been following this closely for months. I think Warren is playing a two-front game on purpose. He keeps the Indiana process moving forward with concrete steps, geotechnical studies, union negotiations, public pressure from Governor Braun. And at the same time, he leaves the Illinois door cracked open, not fully closed, because there are still legislators in Springfield who told local media that Warren called ahead of the June announcement to signal the door remained open. Why would he do that if he has already decided to leave? Because in the stadium business world, the best way to get a deal in your home city is to show that city you have a real advanced alternative somewhere else. Every geotechnical study in Hammond, every meeting with Indiana unions is direct pressure on Springfield. The problem is this game has an expiration date. At some point, Indiana is going to demand a final commitment, and Warren will not be able to keep playing both tables at once. There is one more thing in Warren's words that caught my attention that almost nobody mentioned. He compared this process to building US Bank Stadium in Minneapolis, saying that was also a challenge. Think about that comparison. Minneapolis finished their stadium. It was a long process, full of political fights, but it got done. Warren choosing that comparison in public sounds like someone trying to convince the audience and maybe himself that the outcome is going to be positive no matter where the stadium ends up. And to close this topic with the honesty it deserves, at that same event, Warren said he regrets that Chicago did not host World Cup matches this summer, while Seattle, Texas, and Miami did, and he used that as an argument in favor of a fixed-roof stadium. Look, I get the argument. A dome lets you host events year-round, but for the crowd that attended that event, including gubernatorial candidate Darren Bailey and several frustrated fans, that kind of comment sounded more like public relations than an actual plan. People wanted a timeline. Warren gave them World Cup nostalgia. My conclusion on the stadium, being as honest as I can be, if Illinois does not produce a concrete legislative offer before this year ends, the Bears are going to Hammond. Not because Indiana's perfect, it has its own unresolved financial doubts, but because it is the only thing moving forward with real steps while Illinois keeps talking. And it hurts to say this as a fan of a 91-year-old franchise in this city, but inaction is also a decision, and Illinois has been making that decision for 3 years without realizing it. And this connects directly to what is next, because if the defensive front and the stadium are external question marks, the receiver position is where the Bears, for the first time in years, have a problem of abundance. And look, this genuinely has me torn, so let me try to give you the most honest analysis possible without hiding my own uncertainty. After the Bears traded DJ Moore to the Buffalo Bills this offseason, the most obvious question on the offensive roster opened up. Who is Caleb Williams' #1 receiver in 2026? And the two possible answers have a first and last name: Rome Odunze and Luther Burden III. Let's start with Odunze, because his story this offseason has a layer of complexity that goes beyond pure football. Odunze suffered a stress fracture in his foot during the second half of last season that cost him the final 5 games of the regular season. He came back for the playoffs, but barely played, 4 catches for 88 yards across 2 games, and Ben Johnson himself admitted he protected Odunze from himself, pulling him after a setback during pre-game warm-ups against Cleveland. And here's what genuinely worries me, and I want to read you almost word for word what Odunze himself said this spring about his recovery, and I am reading this almost word for word because every part of it matters. He said this is his new normal, that it is not that he is always in pain, but that the way his foot broke created calluses that created different bone structure, things that shifted around, and he added a comparison that honestly left me thinking. He said it is like tearing your shoulder ligament, that it never really goes back to fully normal. A player at 100% does not talk like that. What you are hearing is someone processing in real time that his body changed permanently, and the uncomfortable question almost nobody is asking out loud is this: if the player himself says he is never going to be fully normal again, can the organization really build the 2026 offensive plan assuming he is going to hold up for 16 or 17 games as the #1 receiver? Ben Johnson, for his part, came out in June to lower the temperature on the concern. He said, word for word, that there is nothing new to him, that Odunze is out there, says he feels great, looks good to him, that they go back and forth with the coaching staff about it, but that he looks like the same old Rome, so he thinks they are in good shape. Look, I understand why a coach says that publicly, but I am also aware that coaches downplay injuries constantly until they cannot anymore. I am not saying Johnson is lying. I am saying the public evidence, the player's own direct quote, and the coach's own public quote do not say exactly the same thing, and that deserves us watching this closely in camp instead of assuming it is already settled. Now, on the other side of this equation is Luther Burden III, and here the story is almost the opposite. Pure momentum, zero physical red flags. Burden had an uneven start to his rookie season in 2025. There were weeks where he barely showed up in the game plan, and that raised legitimate doubts about whether he was more of a specialized slot receiver than a complete threat. But over the final 8 weeks of the regular season, Burden was on a 1,000-yard pace, while opposing teams were already respecting him more in coverage. That is not a product of scheme. That is a player learning to generate his own advantage within the system. Courtney Cronin of ESPN named Odunze as one of the players with the most at stake entering camp precisely because of this competition, and the phrase she used sums this up perfectly. With a hungry Luther Burden III also eyeing the top receiver distinction, Odunze has to prove he can lock down that role. My personal read, and I want to be transparent that this could completely change in the first weeks of preseason, I think in terms of pure talent, Odunze remains the more complete receiver, with a better route tree and a higher ceiling as a traditional number 1 option. But the foot is a real variable, not something I made up or some sensationalist outlet invented. It is a direct quote from the player himself, and Burden, without that physical risk on the table, enters camp with less structural uncertainty, even with less proven track record in a full-time lead receiver role. And here's something I think is key that almost nobody is discussing with the seriousness it deserves. Ben Johnson, in recent weeks, made it very clear that a priority of his 2026 offense is putting the ball in Burden's hands as much as possible. That does not sound like a coach who is going to passively wait to see who wins the camp competition. That sounds like a coach who already started designing the attack, assuming Burden is going to have an expanded role, with or without the outcome of that internal competition. If I had to bet today, and I could be completely wrong, I think we end the season with both of them near 1,000 yards, not because the organization wants to split the ball evenly out of courtesy, but because the real ceiling of this offense depends on both being simultaneous threats that the opponent cannot double cover. The problem is that ideal scenario only works if Odunze's foot holds up for the entire season, and that, to me, remains the single most important unanswered question of the entire receiver training camp. And there you have it, fam. 3 stories that at their core are all talking about the same thing, an organization making big decisions on 3 different fronts at the same time. Who fixes the pass rush at the right price? Where this franchise is going to play for the next 50 years? And who gets the ball when it matters most? Ryan Poles has 2 edge rusher options on the table with completely different risk profiles. Kevin Warren is playing political chess with the future of the franchise, and Ben Johnson has to decide in the coming weeks of camp who his number 1 receiver is, without being able to control the single most important variable in that decision, which is the health of a foot that not even the player himself guarantees at 100%. Bear down, always. If this video gave you something, hit the like button, subscribe, and tell me down in the comments. Between Josh Sweat and Max Crosby, if the Bears could only go after one of the 2 this year, who do you pick and why? I want to read every single answer. See you in the next one.